A flatbed trailer backed into the parking lot on a Wednesday morning, and nobody stopped it. She watched from the kitchen window. A man she knew by blood, and nothing else, walked past her into the back bedroom without a word. 8 trips down the stairs, a toolbox, a welding rig, a set of truck keys lifted from the hook by the door like they had always belonged to him. On the last trip out, he stopped at the bookshelf, looked at the worn Bible sitting between a stack of utility bills and a coffee mug with a chipped rim. "Keep your daddy's church stuff," he said, and then he was gone. She was 19 years old. She had $47. The apartment lease was in a dead man's name, and the truck in the parking lot was driving away. And the only thing left on that shelf, the only thing he hadn't wanted, was the one thing he never should have left behind. She reached for it. 19 years old, with $47 in her pocket and a duffel bag that smelled like the lavender dryer sheets her father had used since she was small, Olivia Scott stood in the parking lot of a Shell station in Garner, North Carolina, and watched the paramedics load her father into an ambulance she already knew was too late. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse onto the asphalt the way people did in movies. She stood very still in the March cold with her arms wrapped around her own ribs, and she watched and she memorized the specific shade of gray the sky had turned. Not stormy gray, not dramatic gray, the kind of gray that didn't mean anything, but the kind of gray that just happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, when a 52-year-old man was carrying drywall up a flight of stairs for a client in Ghana, and his left arm went numb, and he sat down on the landing and didn't get back up. A medic who spoke to her was young, younger than she expected. He had a clipboard and kind eyes, and he said the words that people say in those moments, the careful clinical language that is designed to be true without being cruel. Right? And somewhere inside the arrangement of his sentences was the information she needed, which was that her father had been gone before the ambulance arrived, and that there was nothing anyone could have done, and that he was very sorry for her loss. Olivia said thank you, because what else do you say? To the young paramedic with the clipboard, in a parking lot in March. With the sky that particular shade of meaningless gray. It happened 8 days later in a small chapel on the east side of Ghana that James Scott had never attended in his life. 11 people came, his former supervisor from a roofing company he'd left 4 years ago. Neighbors from the apartment complex who knew him only by the sound of his boots in the hallway at 6 in the morning. A woman Olivia didn't recognize who sat in the very last pew in a denim jacket and left before the service was over, slipping out through the side door so quietly that Olivia only noticed the empty seat afterward and the small square of folded paper left behind on the cushion. She didn't open the paper then. They put it in the pocket of the black dress she'd borrowed from her co-worker Tess at the Shell station, the one who was 3 inches shorter than her, so the hem hit just above the knee, and she kept tugging it down during the service. Think about the paper later. Later kept moving further away. Ronald came 20 minutes late. He slipped in through the back door in a flannel shirt and dark jeans, not dressed for a funeral, so much as dressed for a thing he hadn't fully decided to show up to. He stood in the rear of the chapel with his arms crossed over his chest, the way a man stands when he wants to be present and absent at the same time. Olivia saw him when she turned to take her seat in the front pew. She turned back around. The pastor, a man named Delwyn, who had a soft southern accent and a kind face that suggested he had done this particular thing many times, looked to Father James Allen Scott. His middle name was Patrick. She didn't correct him. She sat in the front pew in the too-short dress, and she looked at the photo they had placed on a small easel beside the podium. James at maybe 45, like squinting into afternoon sunlight somewhere she couldn't place, the lines around his eyes deep and earned. And she tried to remember the last thing he had said to her, something about the truck needing an oil change, mentioned it at breakfast 3 days before he died. She'd been half asleep over her coffee, and she'd said, "Yeah, okay, I'll remind you this weekend." And he'd said, "Thanks, kiddo, I ought." And that was the last full conversation they'd had, and she had not thought about it at all until she was sitting in the front pew of a funeral chapel on a Tuesday morning, trying to find something more significant to hold on to. A truck needing an oil change. That's what he left her with. Except the truck wasn't hers to worry about anymore, because Ronald had the keys. After the service, people formed the small, quiet cluster that forms after funerals, like the one where everyone says the right things and means some of them. James was a good man. He was always willing to help. If you need anything, please don't hesitate. Nobody hesitated to call her in the following 3 weeks. Mustn't expect them to. These were the social rituals of grief, and she understood their function even when their comfort ran thin. Ronald left without speaking to her. Late, she watched him cross the parking lot toward James's truck. Already Ronald's truck in his posture, in the casual way he pulled the keys from his pocket. And she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say yet. The truck had been in James's name. There was no will she knew of. There was a lot she didn't know yet. In the pocket of the borrowed dress, the folded paper from the woman in the denim jacket. She would read it later in the apartment kitchen, flattening it on the counter beside her cold coffee. The handwriting was neat and direct. James fixed my display counter 4 years ago, the whole front counter at my shop. I tried to pay him. Looked like I needed the money more than he needed the job. He was right. I still thought about it. Donna Jackson. Below that, a phone number. She kept the note. She didn't call the number. Not yet. She filed it in the same mental category as everything else that was accumulating in those first weeks. The things that would matter once she had enough distance to understand what they meant. The apartment in Ghana was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a complex called Pine View, which had no pines and no view, and which her father had rented for 11 years, which was the entirety of Olivia's conscious memory. Every crack in the ceiling above her childhood bed. She knew the way the heat came on too strong in winter and the specific sound the upstairs neighbor made when he walked to the bathroom at 2 in the morning. She knew this place the way you know somewhere that has never felt like yours but has always been where you went at the end of the day. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Wednesday morning when she was packing boxes because the landlord had given her 30 days, and the lease was in James's name, and she was 19 years old, with $11 an hour, and no cosigner and no credit history, and no clear answer to the question of where she would go next. On that Wednesday morning, she heard the diesel engine in the parking lot below. She knew the sound. Ronald's truck. James's truck. The truck, she went to the kitchen window and looked down. Ronald was backing a flatbed trailer into the lot. Sharon sat in the passenger seat with her phone in both hands, scrolling, not looking at anything in particular. The trailer was empty, which meant it had come to be filled. Olivia walked to the front door and opened it before Ronald reached the top of the stairs. His voice, when it came, carried the flat authority of someone who had decided the conversation before arriving. Your daddy owed me $4,000. I'm collecting. He moved past her into the apartment and kept walking toward the back bedroom where James kept his tools, and Olivia stood in the hallway and understood that the decision she had not made was being made for her by circumstance, a particular shape of a family she had not chosen and could not undo. Here is the thing about standing in a doorway watching someone take your father's belongings. The thing nobody tells you. It doesn't feel like robbery, doesn't feel like injustice. Not at first, not while it's happening. It feels like being inside a dream where the rules have shifted and you don't yet understand the new ones, and you are trying very hard to act like you do. Olivia stood in the hallway and watched 3 trips happen. First the tools. The Milwaukee rolling toolbox that James had bought piece by piece over 8 years, adding 1 drawer at a time when he had a good month. The electric drill, the circular saw, the welding rig that had taken him 2 full years of side jobs to afford. The one he polished the housing of every few weeks with a soft cloth like it was something precious, which it was, which he would never have described it as. Truck keys from the hook by the front door, which made Olivia understand that she no longer had a car. Then the kitchen table, which Ronald said he had built himself 15 years ago and was getting back what was his. Olivia did not remember Ronald building the kitchen table. She remembered her father sanding it one afternoon when she was maybe 9, crouched on the floor with a piece of medium grit paper, working the surface in long, careful strokes until it was smooth as skin. But she had no proof, so she stood in the living room with her arms at her sides and said nothing. On his last trip out, Ronald paused at the door, looked around the apartment, at the marks on the wall where pictures had hung, at the empty corners where furniture had stood, at the kitchen that now had no table and would soon have no tenant. He looked at the bookshelf beside the front door, that James had built from pine boards and wall brackets, the one that held the small collection of objects James kept always within reach. 3 paperback novels with white spines, a baby mug that said Ghana County Fair 2009 with a chipped rim, a stack of utility envelopes, and the Bible. The Bible had been on that shelf for as long as Olivia could remember. Worn brown leather, the color of something that had been handled every day for decades, the spine soft and curved from years of being opened and closed. James wasn't a religious man in any formal sense. He never went to church, never spoke about faith in any direct way, but he kept that Bible on the shelf the way some people keep a compass. Not because they are always navigating, but because they like knowing where north is. Ronald looked at the Bible for a moment, looked away. "You can keep your daddy's church stuff," he said. And then he was gone. Olivia stood in the middle of the empty living room for a long time after the engine sound faded from the parking lot. The floor was cheap laminate that clicked when you walked on it, and she sat with her back against the wall, where the couch had been, and she looked at the room and she ran the numbers, because running the numbers was the only productive thing available to her at that moment. $47 in her checking account and no savings, because there had never been enough at one time to save. A part-time job at the Shell station that paid $11 an hour and approximately 22 hours a week worked out to just over $1,000 a month before taxes. No car, no cosigner, no credit history. 30 days before the landlord needed the apartment back, and the shelf with the Bible on it, which Ronald hadn't wanted. She got up off the floor at midnight because her back had started to ache, and because sitting in the dark, feeling the size of the problem wasn't making it smaller. Boiled water in a pot. Ronald had taken the electric kettle and made instant coffee, and she stood at the counter with the mug, and she looked at the bookshelf. She pulled the Bible from the shelf. The spine cracked faintly when she opened it, a sound of something that has been resting and is being asked to work again. The pages were thin and semi-translucent at the edges, and the margins were clean, which surprised her. Expected her father to have written in it, the way people who actually read their Bibles do, small notes and underlines and dates beside significant passages. But the pages were unmarked. Whatever James had been looking for in these pages, I kept it between himself and the words. She was turning slowly, not reading, just moving through, when something shifted in the weight of the book between her hands, between Psalms and Proverbs, a piece of paper, folded twice, lying flat against the page as though it had been placed there carefully and had been waiting quietly for exactly this. Almost missed it, because the paper was the same thin stock as the pages, and in the dim kitchen light it seemed for a moment to be part of the text. I felt the different weight of it beneath her fingers, and she stopped, and she lifted it out and she unfolded it on the counter. A deed, stamped with the seal of the county clerk's office, dated 7 years ago, 2 acres, lot 14, a creek road, the name on the deed, James Patrick Scott, the purchase price, $340. Olivia read it 3 times. Then she put the coffee down, because her hands had started to feel uncertain and she didn't want to spill anything. She read it a 4th time. Her father had owned land for 7 years, 2 acres of land somewhere in this county, purchased for $340, and he had never said a single word about it. Not to her, not that she'd heard. Once in 7 years of Saturday mornings, when he kissed her forehead and said he was picking up side work and came home in the evening with sawdust in his hair and the particular tiredness of a man who had been building something. Turned the deed over. On the back, a second piece of paper was folded inside the first, a hand-drawn map on a piece of notebook paper. James's handwriting, block capitals, the way he always wrote, and precise as though he'd wanted to make sure there was no chance of misreading. Ghana to Ridgeton, 40 mil north, we 58, to Pine Forked. Lift at the church, K, gravel, 2 mil, lot 14 on right, break in the tree line. Olivia stood at the counter for a long time, 7 years. Every Saturday morning, 360 Saturdays, give or take. He'd kissed her forehead and said he was picking up side work, and she had believed him, had thought nothing of it, because it was so consistent with who he was. A man who worked constantly, who filled gaps in his schedule with more work the way other people fill gaps with television, and for whom labor was as natural as breathing. And on every one of those Saturday mornings, he had driven somewhere 40 miles north of Ghana. He had done something. He had built something. For 7 years, she picked up her phone. It's 20 minutes past midnight. She set it down again. She made herself finish the coffee. A Greyhound to Rocky Mount left Ghana at 6:45 in the morning and cost $21, which left her 26. She had packed the duffel bag the night before. 2 changes of clothes, a notebook she used for work schedules, the deed, tape, a phone charger, a water bottle, and the folded note from Donna Jackson, which she could not quite bring herself to leave behind. She had not slept. She had sat in the empty apartment until 4 in the morning, alternating between reading the deed again and looking at nothing in particular. Then she had showered and changed and walked to the bus station in the particular pre-dawn quiet of a Wednesday that doesn't know yet what kind of day it's going to be. From Rocky Mount, she took the County Connector bus west, out that stopped at 6 different towns before it reached Ridgeton, and that the driver navigated with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had made this drive every day for many years. Sat near the window and watched North Carolina go from suburb to rural, to the particular kind of rural that has given up on becoming suburban and is at peace with what it is. The small farms with their weathered equipment, the stands of loblolly pine, the long flat fields that had already been turned for spring planting. The bus dropped her at a Shell station on the southern edge of Ridgeton at 2:47 in the afternoon. She stepped onto the cracked concrete of the parking lot and looked around. Ridgeton was smaller than she'd expected, in the way that places you've never been to, but have imagined, are always different from the imagining. Main road running north to south. A hardware store with a wooden sign and plants in window boxes that someone was actually maintaining. A diner with a handwritten special taped to the glass. A Baptist church painted white. A parking lot half full on a Wednesday afternoon. A post office the size of a large closet. An insurance agency whose sign had lost one letter. A barber shop with a closed sign in the window, and the particular stillness of a place that had been closed longer than the sign admitted. Each stood on the sidewalk with her duffel bag over one shoulder and the deed folded in her jacket pocket, and she considered her options. $26 in her checking account. No car. Phone signal too weak to load a map. Voted 4 miles east of where she needed to be by the crude measure of the hand-drawn map, with no way of getting there except the 2 feet she'd arrived with. The hardware store had its lights on and its door propped open. Gary Young was behind the counter when she came in, reading a newspaper folded to the crossword, his reading glasses pushed up to his forehead in the way of a man who puts them there to think, and then forgets they're not on his face. In his late 60s, solidly built in the way of a man whose body had recorded every year of physical work it had ever been asked to do. He looked up when the door opened, and he looked at her the way Gary Young looked at most things, most directly and without the performance of casualness. I'm looking for Miller Creek Road. She set her duffel bag down at her feet. Gary put down his pen. He took his glasses off his forehead and folded them and set them on the counter. He studied her face with the unhurried attention of someone who has time for what he is doing and understands that looking carefully before speaking is not a delay but a discipline. His voice, when it came, was quiet and certain in a way that rearranged the air in the room. You're James's daughter. Not a question, not a polite approximation. Like the certainty of someone who has seen enough of the world to recognize a thing when it walks through his door. The words hit her somewhere in the center of her chest with the specific force of the unexpected. She had not expected to be recognized, not expected anyone here to know her face or to connect her face to her father's name in the span of a single look. You knew my father, 7 years. Every Saturday morning. Coffee before he started, sometimes a second cup around noon if he came back for supplies. Gary's expression settled into something adjacent to grief, the look of a man who has already done the processing and is living in what comes after it. I heard he passed. "I'm real sorry," she said, "thank you," and meant it more precisely than she had meant it at the funeral, because this was the first person who had said those words to her who had actually shared space with James, handed him coffee on actual Saturday mornings, who had a specific living person to place the loss against. She told him she'd found the deed, that she hadn't known her father owned land, that she'd come to see what was there. Gary nodded, moved around the counter and pulled a stool out from under it and set it in front of her. She didn't sit down, but she was grateful for the gesture, the way a small courtesy in a difficult moment can carry more weight than it has any right to. The creek road was 4 miles east of town, he told her. Out the main road past the Baptist church, left at the fork where the stop sign used to be before somebody hit it in 2019, and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. Gravel road, about 2 miles in. Lot 14 was on the right side. She'd see a break in the tree line, a dirt track wide enough for a truck, with a cleared path running back into the pines. She asked him what was there. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has decided that the truth is not his to give in this particular instance, that some things are most useful when they are arrived at rather than described. "I think you ought to go see for yourself." Left 4 miles in sneakers that had been bought for standing behind a gas station counter and were not designed for distance walking. April in North Carolina, and the air smelled like wet earth and new growth, and the dogwood along the roadside was flowering in extravagant pink and white clusters that seemed almost aggressive in their cheerfulness, given everything. Walked past the Baptist church, its parking lot quieter now than when she'd passed on the bus, past the missing stop sign at the fork, where someone had spray-painted a red octagon on the wooden post as a stopgap measure, a gravel road that narrowed as the pine trees pressed in on both sides until it felt less like a road and more like a suggestion. She counted mailboxes out of habit. There were 2 on the entire stretch of road, both rusted, both for lots that showed no signs of habitation, no tire tracks, no lights behind the tree lines. The gravel crunched under her sneakers in the particular way of a surface that has not been driven on in several weeks, stones loose and unadhered, grass pushing up between them in the optimistic way that grass pushes into any space that pauses long enough to invite it. Her feet ached. Her right shoulder had started to complain about the duffel bag. She had eaten nothing since a granola bar on the bus, and the light was already moving toward the soft amber of early evening. That specific gold that means you have 2 hours of useful daylight left if you're working outside, and less if you're trying to navigate an unfamiliar property in the woods. And then she saw it a break in the tree line, just as Gary had described. That track pressed into the earth by years of the same vehicle, going in and coming out, the ruts worn into something almost like grooves, the path as specific and intentional as a signature. Like grass had begun to reclaim the center stripe, the kind of thing that happens after 3 weeks without traffic, when the land starts to remember what it was before. Olivia stood at the entrance of the track for a moment, long enough to understand that whatever she found at the end of it was going to matter, and that mattering could mean very different things. She'd had come 40 miles on a bus and a connector route, and 4 miles on foot to find out which kind. Then she walked in. The pines were close on both sides, their branches interlacing overhead. Light came through filtered and green, and different from the light on the road. The air smelled denser, older, the particular smell of a place that has been growing undisturbed. The track curved gently for perhaps 100 yards, a little more, and then the trees opened. She stopped in the middle of the clearing. On a slight rise of land that gave it presence stood a structure. Not a ruin, not a shed, but the rotted hunting cabin she had half expected from a 7-year-old auction purchase for $340. A house small, compact was the better word, the size of something designed for sufficiency rather than excess. Unfinished, clearly, the way a piece of work looks when the person who was doing it stopped in the middle rather than at the end. But structurally sound in a way she could see even from where she stood, even with no training in reading buildings. Some things announce themselves. Real lumber, quality lumber, not the cheap dimensional pine that warps in a season, but the kind that costs more and holds its shape for decades. The roof was complete. Dark asphalt shingles laid in straight, even lines that spoke of someone who understood the hierarchy of construction, who understood that the roof must be right before anything else can be right. Like sides of the exterior walls were sheathed in plywood, weatherproofed with a dark gray house wrap stapled into every seam. The fourth side, the one facing south, the one that caught the afternoon light, was fully finished in pale blue clapboard siding, each board set with the precision of someone who checked the level twice and then checked it a third time because they were building something that needed to be right. The front had a framed-out porch structure, right above a welcoming space, 2 posts, a header beam, a subfloor extending out past the front wall. No railing, no steps. The porch floor hung suspended over the ground with nothing connecting it to the earth, though the person building it had gotten exactly to the last stage and then run out of time. She walked across the clearing toward it. Her legs felt strange, not tired, something else. A sensation that arrives when what is actually happening begins to register in the body before the mind has caught up to it. The front door was a sheet of plywood fitted into a rough frame, held shut by a hasp and padlock. She tugged it once, solid. She walked around the south side of the house, pushing through knee-high grass and small seedling pines taking advantage of the clearing, past a blue poly tarp weighted down with stones that covered what turned out to be a substantial stack of lumber. Cedar 2x6s mostly, dry and fragrant where the tarp had kept them. Past a wheelbarrow turned upside down and left that way. Air of the house, a window, no glass yet. In this one, the frame was built, rough sill and header in place, but the opening was covered with a sheet of translucent plastic sheeting stapled to the frame. They pressed her palm against it and felt the give of it, the slight warmth of trapped air behind the plastic. She peeled back one corner and looked in. The room on the other side was finished, completely, carefully, precisely finished. They are all on all 4 walls, taped at the seams and mudded smooth and painted a soft, clean white that caught the evening light coming through the window on the east wall. That window had glass, real insulated glass in a wood frame, looked east, toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing, toward the direction from which the morning sun would come first and strongest. Against the north wall, a cot with a folded wool blanket, gray with a thin red stripe, a east wall below the window, a plastic storage bin with a 2-burner propane camp stove sitting on top, a white enamel camp mug, a lantern, and on the south wall, a shelf, pine-stained warm honey, mounted at a height that was wrong for her father, who stood 6 feet 2 and would have had to stoop slightly to use it. Mounted at the height of a woman who was 5'7", who had always kept her own things at exactly that height. Egg had mentioned once, years ago, that the shelves in her bedroom were too high and she had to stand on her toes to reach her own books. James had mounted that shelf before there was a daughter standing in front of it, had measured the height of a specific person and built the shelf for that height, and that person was her. Olivia climbed through the window. The room smelled like sawdust and pine resin, and something underneath that was so familiar it closed her throat before she could identify it. Old Spice and wood, and the particular smell of the wool work jacket James wore from October to April, the dark green one with the corduroy collar, the one that had hung on the hook by the apartment door for as long as she could remember. She stood in the middle of the finished room with her hands at her sides, and she pressed her eyes closed. I'd say anything. There was nothing to say yet. There was only standing here, in a room that had been built for her by a man who was no longer alive, in a house that had been 40 miles away from her for 7 years, while she slept in a 3rd-floor apartment and thought she knew what her father did on Saturdays. When she opened her eyes, she looked at the cot, and then she looked under it. Edge of a notebook, a spiral-bound composition book with a black and white marbled cover, the kind her father bought by the dozen at the dollar store and used for everything. Materials lists, client notes, measurements, occasional reminder to himself written in the block capitals he used for everything because his cursive had always been. In his own words, a crime against legibility. She knelt and pulled it out. The cover was soft from handling, stained with a coffee ring and a long dark smear that might have been wood stain. She opened it, inside the front cover, in her father's block print hand, precise and definite and unmistakably his, Olivia's house. Started April 2018. They sat down on the cot. The wool blanket beneath her was rough and it smelled like him. Outside, the light was going gold with the specific quality of a late April evening, softening everything, and she sat in the room her father had finished first, his sleeping room, the one he'd made livable before anything else, and she read. The notebook was organized the way James organized everything, not the way an architect would organize it, but the way a man who knew exactly what he was building would. Materials, lists, suppliers, costs broken down with the precision of someone for whom every dollar had to be accounted for. Siding, $87. Roofing nails, $12. The east window bought used from a salvage yard for $41. The camp stove, second-hand from a sporting goods store closing sale. And between the construction notes, scattered through the pages like plants growing between stones, something else. On page 4, in the middle of a list of sheathing calculations, east window for Olivia's room. She always said she wanted to wake up with the sun. Light was what she asked for when she was small. On page 11, below a note about roofing underlayment. Porch faces south. Big enough for 2 chairs. She'll want a dog someday. On page 14, beside a supplier phone number. Window over the sink. Small house needs a view. She stands at the window when she washes things. Always has, on page 19 in larger letters than the surrounding text. Kitchen almost framed. Small, but she doesn't need big. It's hers. Olivia sat on the cot and read until the light through the east window had gone from gold to orange to purple to nothing, and she had to hold the notebook close to catch the last dim glow from the clearing outside. 23 pages. Read all of them. The final entry was on page 23. It was dated 14 days before her father died. Almost done. 3, maybe 4 months of work left. Give it to her on her 21st. Fight me on it. She always fights anything that feels like too much. But she needs to know she has it. She needs to know I saw her, not just what I hoped for her, what she actually is. I saw her every single day. I see her. Still sitting there, notebook in her lap, when she heard the sound outside, careful feet in the grass, the particular hesitation of something uncertain of its welcome. A shape appeared at the window where the plastic sheeting still hung open from where she had climbed through. Medium-sized, low to the ground, the profile of a dog against the darkening sky, looked at the window ledge and looked at her with dark eyes that caught what little light remained. She didn't move. The dog stayed. After a long moment in which neither of them made any demands of the other, placed its front paws on the windowsill and hauled itself up and over, moving with the practiced ease of something that had done this many times before. Brown and white, she could see when it was inside, a torn left ear and ribs that showed clearly through its coat. It walked 3 careful circles in the far corner of the room. Then it lay down. Olivia looked at the dog. The words came out before she'd decide to say them. You knew him, didn't you? Not a question. Just a fact being named out loud in a room full of facts that needed naming. The dog put its head on its front paws and looked at her steadily and did not disagree. She pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders. Like east window, she could see the first stars appearing in the strip of sky visible above the clearing. More stars than she ever saw from the apartment parking lot in Ghana. The silence was complete and dimensional, kind of quiet that has weight to it, the kind you only find when you are far enough from roads and people and the constant low machinery of populated life. She opened the notebook again. She held it up to the window to catch the starlight. At page 23, below the final entry, she read the last 4 words her father had written. I see her. Closed the notebook and held it against her chest in the finished room he had built, in the unfinished house he had never gotten to give her. The first time in 3 weeks, she felt something other than the particular cold that moves into the space left by grief. Not warmth exactly, not safety, but location, here, in a specific place that had a name attached to it that was hers. Had $47 and a deed and a notebook full of her father's handwriting, and a dog whose name she did not yet know sleeping in the corner of a room her father had painted white and built a shelf in at exactly her height. Think about the rest of it in the morning. Outside, Something moved in the trees at the edge of the clearing. Just the wind, probably, just a branch settling into the evening, and the clearing held its quiet. The stars kept appearing one by one until the sky above the east window was thick with them, and Olivia Scott sat in the house her father had built for her in 7 years of Saturdays, and she breathed, and she stayed. She woke to sunlight. Direct, unfiltered kind that comes through a window facing east when the sky is clear and the hour is early, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it lands on your face. For 3 seconds she didn't know where she was. And she felt the wool blanket, smelled the sawdust, heard the particular quality of silence to cleared land surrounded by pine forest in the morning, the silence that has texture and depth rather than just the absence of sound. The dog was awake, sitting near the interior door watching her with an expression she had already begun to interpret as patient rather than demanding. She sat up and looked around the room in daylight, as different from the room she'd been in the night before. Better, in the specific way that daylight makes craftsmanship legible. The paint was good, not the slightly uneven paint of someone new to the work, deliberate, thorough paint of someone who understood that the prep was the paint, who had sanded and primed before he ever opened a can of white. The floor had been sanded smooth, the woodboards fitted tightly, sealed against moisture. The supply shelf along the west wall, and on it, as though he had known someone might arrive without warning, were 3 cans of pinto beans, a jar of peanut butter with the lid screwed on tight, a box of water purification tablets, a gallon jug of water sealed with duct tape around the cap. Emergency supplies, organized with the same forethought he applied to everything. Had stocked this room, like someone who understood that the person eventually arriving might arrive with nothing. She ate peanut butter with her fingers and drank water, and then she went to explore the rest of what her father had built, bigger than it looked from outside. The finished room was the smallest space in the house. Through the interior door was a larger open space that would eventually be a kitchen and living area combined, the framing visible above, wiring already run in tidy lines through drilled holes in the studs. Against one wall, 3 kitchen base cabinets, installed plumb and level, built from knotty pine, sanded and sealed with a penetrating oil finish. No countertop yet. The butcher block panels were leaning against the far wall, wrapped in brown paper, waiting to be cut and installed. A window opening over the sink area. No glass yet on this north-facing opening. Fixed at the height, the sink would eventually sit and looked out glazed frame and understood immediately why her father had put the window there. Someone washing dishes at that sink would see the whole clearing, the curve of the tree line, open sky above it. He had known she would stand there. He had built her a view. In the hallway leading toward the back of the house, she found the breaker panel and flipped it on. A hum of something coming to life. She switched the circuit for the kitchen, and a pendant light came on above the counter. Brushed nickel, simple. Exactly the kind of light you'd want in a kitchen in the evening. The father had wired a house and chosen the fixture for the kitchen before the kitchen existed. She was still taking inventory of what he had completed and what remained when she heard the engine. An old truck, lighter than Ronald's diesel, regular idol of high mileage and faithful maintenance. She moved to the south-facing window opening and looked out at the clearing, a green pickup, mid-90s, paint faded to the color of sage. Banks turned off the dirt track and stopped at the edge of the clearing. A woman got out. She was in her middle 70s, the kind of 74 that carries its years as information rather than burden. Small in stature, economical in movement, her hair cut short. Flannel shirt tucked into jeans above tall rubber-soled boots that had tracked through enough mud seasons to have developed their own particular patina. Stood beside her truck and looked at the house for a long moment. Then she looked at Olivia, standing in the window opening on the south side. "Well," the woman said, across the clearing's distance. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Olivia came around to the front of the house and stood in the clearing below the porch frame. The woman walked toward her, with the careful, deliberate stride of someone whose hips had started filing complaints that her mind had declined to honor. Kate Wilson. She stopped 10 feet away, 2 miles that direction, a gesture east. I've been watching this property since James stopped coming 3 weeks ago. Figured something was wrong. Then I heard from Gary Young in town about what he was building. I knew he was building. First year, I thought he was a hunter. Then I saw the lumber deliveries. Margaret looked at the house the way people look at things they have watched become what they always intended to be. Third year I walked over with a thermos and said hello. He was shy about it at first. After a while he told me, "What did he tell you?" Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact, not gentle in the performative way of people who mistake gentleness for the absence of truth. That he was building a house for his daughter, that she'd been through some hard years, that he wanted her to have a place that was actually hers, not rented, not borrowed, hers. He was going to give it to her when she turned 21. Drive her up, walk her through, hand her the key, a beat of quiet in which the clearing held its own breath. He didn't make it, Olivia said. No, Ike looked at her steadily. He didn't. The dog, Flint, Margaret would tell her. James had named him Flint, a stray who'd appeared 2 years ago, and whom James had started feeding every Saturday, and for whom he'd built a small plywood shelter near the tree line, was sitting near the porch frame by now, patient Margaret with the same patient attention he gave to everything. "Come on," Margaret said. "You need real breakfast, not whatever's in those cans." I turned and walked back toward her truck with the same deliberate economy with which she did everything. "Bring the dog if you want. He knows where I live." Olivia picked up her duffel bag from inside the window and climbed out through the frame and walked across the clearing. Light-joined Flint fell in beside her at the careful 2-inch distance of an animal that has learned to move close to people without assuming anything about its welcome. It was still early morning. The clearing was full of light, honest spring light that made everything it touched look like what it was. The house stood in the middle of it, pale blue on the south side, plywood gray on the other 3, unfinished and solid, patient with what remained undone. Paid $47 and a deed, and a dog named Flint, and a notebook that held 7 years of her father's handwriting, and she had a neighbor who was walking toward a green truck and expecting her to follow. She started walking, part 2. Out Margaret Wilson's kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking, and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in by someone who knew what they were doing with a cast-iron skillet. The table was solid oak, smooth at the edges from decades of use. Olivia sat at it and ate scrambled eggs and toast, and 2 strips of bacon without speaking for the first several minutes, because she was hungrier than she had allowed herself to acknowledge until food was actually in front of her. There is a specific kind of hunger that arrives after sustained crisis, even the body suppresses while the mind is occupied with more urgent things, and then releases all at once when safety appears in the form of a plate of eggs on a warm kitchen table. Flint sat under the table near her feet, not touching. Present, Margaret sat across from her with a cup of coffee in both hands. The way you hold a cup when you're using it to anchor yourself to the moment rather than to drink from it. Olivia eat without comment and without the particular hovering attention of someone who needs to be thanked for their generosity. She simply provided it and let it be what it was. When Olivia had finished, Margaret refilled her coffee without being asked, and then sat back down and said, "How much do you know about the property?" Not a question exactly. An opening. What's on the deed? 2 acres. Lot 14. Addie bought it at a county tax auction 7 years ago. Margaret set her own cup down. Previous owner died with no heirs and unpaid taxes going back 4 years. The county wanted it off the books, listed as a hunting parcel with a condemned structure. An old deer cabin from the 50s. Rotten through when James bought it. He tore it down to the foundation the first weekend, kept the footprint and built everything else new. Oliver told me. He never told anyone. Just me and Gary, because Gary was selling him the materials. Margaret looked at her steadily. Your daddy was a particular kind of proud, not the kind that needs to be seen, and that won't accept anything less from himself than finished. He wants to give you a complete thing, not a promise, not a plan. A key in a door that opened into something real. Until it was ready for that, I didn't see the point in talking about it. Olivia looked out Margaret's kitchen window, which faced east toward a field just beginning to show the green of whatever she was growing. He thought he had more time, He thought he had 4 months. Exit. Margaret's voice carried the quiet weight of someone who has thought carefully about a thing before speaking it. And I think if you'd asked him whether he would have done it differently, told you sooner, a deed before the house was done, I think he would have said no, because that wasn't the gift. The deed wasn't the gift. The finished thing was the gift. The key was the gift. Olivia traced the grain of the oak table with her thumbnail, long straight lines worn smooth by decades of hands. I need to finish it, she said. Margaret waited. I need a job. I need to be able to buy materials. Gary mentioned he sells to contractors, which means he probably has wholesale accounts. Lanes if I could work something out with him, which means you should go talk to Gary. Margaret stood and refilled her own cup and looked out the window at her field. You have skills? Dad taught me framing basics, rudimentary electrical, to read a material takeoff. Basic plumbing concepts, though I've never actually run pipe. She paused. I know how to use a saw and I know how to follow instructions. I'm willing to learn the rest. Margaret turned from the window, looked at Olivia with the same direct appraising quality she brought to everything. The look of a woman who has lived long enough to evaluate people quickly and accurately, and who has no reason to soften her assessments. Go talk to Gary, she said again, and that settled that. Olivia walked the 4 miles back into town that afternoon. I walked this road many times in the weeks ahead, often enough to know every place where the gravel deepened, and every place where the drainage was bad, and water collected after rain, often enough to note the exact spot where a red-tailed hawk had built a nest in the fork of a dead pine and returned to it each morning. For now she walked it for the second time and noticed the dogwood was more open than it had been in the morning, the blossoms reaching wider in the afternoon warmth, doubted about what she was going to say to Gary Young. Because thinking through what you're going to say before you say. It was something her father had taught her, and she had never stopped doing it. Tell them what you have. Let them what you need. Tell them what you're offering. Let them decide. Gary was stocking a shelf of paint thinner when she came in. He didn't look surprised to see her. She stood at the counter and laid out the situation plainly. She had some carpentry knowledge. She was willing to learn what she didn't know. She needed part-time work and access to materials at cost. She was going to finish the house on lot 14. Gary listened without interrupting. They put the paint thinner down on the shelf and turned to face her fully and took the measure of her the way he'd taken the measure of her when she first walked in, which was directly and without performance. Someone 3 mornings a week, 7 to noon, stocking, deliveries, helping customers find what they need, $12 an hour. A pause in which he let that settle. Materials at my cost, not retail, she did the math. Hours a week, $12. After taxes, roughly $160 a week. Not enough for rent anywhere, which meant she was living in the house, which was either an obstacle or a solution depending on how she held it. Held it as a solution. The house had a finished room. She had a sleeping bag from the Goodwill 2 miles from the Ghana bus station. Why are you doing this? She said. Harry picked up the paint thinner and placed it on the shelf with the precise care of a man who puts things exactly where they belong. Because your father bought materials in this store for 7 years and paid full price every time. I tried to give him a break on a bulk lumber order in year 3. He said no. Said he wanted to earn what he was building. Gary straightened the can so its label faced outward. Least I can do is give his daughter the same chance. Started the following Monday. The work at Gary's was physical and uncomplicated in a way that her brain required during those first weeks. Lifting, sorting, locating, explaining. Basic honesty of knowing at the end of a shift exactly what had been accomplished and exactly what had not. Loaded pallets of 2x4s and organized bins of hardware by size and helped customers find the right sandpaper grit for their particular project and swept the concrete floor twice each shift with the wide push-push broom. Gary kept behind the door to the back room. Gary worked beside her without hovering. He showed her the system once with precision and then trusted her to run it, which was the best kind of teaching. By the end of the first week, she knew where everything was. The finished nails and the framing nails and the roofing nails in their labeled bins along the east wall. The the PVC fittings organized by diameter on the plumbing wall, the chalk lines and the layout squares and the levels on their pegs above the tool wall, that strange small drawer in the back corner that contained specialty hinges in 3 configurations that nobody bought more than once a year, but which Gary refused to stop stocking because when someone needed them, they really needed them, earned the names of the regulars. Boyd, who came in every Tuesday for something related to a fence project that appeared to have been ongoing for several years without approaching completion. Terry, and rental properties on the east side of town, and appeared to be single-handedly keeping the store's plumbing section solvent. Carl and his son Marcus, the only father and son crew operating out of Ridgeton, that bought lumber in quantities that suggested they were either very busy or building something enormous and preferred not to discuss which. Every afternoon, after her shift ended at noon, she walked the 4 miles to Miller Creek Road and she built. Bathroom came first because it had to. James had roughed in all the drain lines, PVC in the right diameters properly sloped, the toilet flange set at finished floor height. But nothing was connected, no supply lines, no fixtures. Like the toilet sitting in the middle of the room, still in its cardboard shipping carton, waiting with the particular patience of things that have been correctly manufactured and are simply waiting to be correctly installed. Watched instructional videos on her phone in the evenings at the camp. Table she'd set up in the kitchen area, pausing and rewinding until she could describe the process in sequence without looking at the screen. I borrowed a pipe wrench from Gary's tool wall. She spent 4 hours on her back under the subfloor on the first day running supply lines, cutting and connecting PVC joints with primer and cement, burning through the doing what the videos could only approximate from a distance. The first joint leaked. She cut it out and redid it. The second had an air gap in the cement from rushing the cure time. I assembled it and started over with more deliberateness, giving each step its full measure of time. The third was correct. Smooth, secure, no flex when she tested the joint by hand, edge, no bubble when she pressed her thumb against a confixictant point when she connected the toilet and filled the tank and flushed it for the first time, and the water moved exactly where it was supposed to move. They sat down on the bathroom floor and laughed, not from happiness exactly, from the specific relief of having done a hard thing correctly after having done it wrong twice, like Caesar. The particular satisfaction that belongs entirely to people who have earned it through failure and revision and the stubborn decision to try again. Hank stood in the doorway and regarded her with an expression she had begun to think of as philosophical. Running water, she told him. That's not nothing. He seemed to accept this assessment and moved on to other concerns. The hot water heater was in James's notebook on page 7. She had read the notebook so many times by then that she knew its organization, the way you know a route you've driven 100 times, without having to think about the individual turns. Check Margaret's shed. 40-gallon gas unit sitting unused since the electric swap in 11. Ask about a trade. Fix the porch railing. She walked over to Margaret's on a Thursday morning before her shift at Gary's. Was on the porch with a book when she arrived, which meant the porch railing James had planned to fix was the one Margaret was currently leaning against. A structure that moved with a subtle but definite give when weight was applied to it. I have a question, Olivia said, standing at the base of the porch steps, and I need you to tell me if it's too much to ask. Margaret put her book face down on the arm of the chair. Ask? Dad's notebook says your husband had a gas water heater in the shed, and that Dad was planning to trade fixing your porch railing for it. He never got to do either. Margaret looked at the railing she was leaning against. Then she stood up with the careful gathering of energy that the move required and said, "Come on then." The unit was in the shed behind the house, dusty but intact, wrapped in the original insulation blanket, the pilot assembly still attached, looking like something that has been waiting in good faith for someone to need it. Margaret helped her load it into the truck bed, because Margaret drove the truck on principle, regardless of what her hips thought about it. Of it, James was going to trade me for it, Margaret said, leaning against the side of the truck while Olivia guided the water heater through the back door opening of the house. He never got around to it. I'll fix your railing, I know you will. Said it the way you say something you have already decided about. Something that is not a hope but a fact that hasn't happened yet. I'm not in any hurry. Installing the water heater took 3 days. A gas line connection was the part she was least certain about, and she called Gary at the store and described what she was looking at, the configuration of the existing line and the unit's connection points. It walked her through it over the phone in the specific, concrete language of someone who has done a thing many times and knows which details actually matter. Made her test the connection with soapy water at 3 different points before she attempted to light the pilot. And at the 3rd point, she found a faint bubble at a fitting she had been certain was right, and she reset the fitting and tested again. And the extra 30 minutes that cost her were the most important 30 minutes of the installation. The first hot shower she took in the house lasted longer than was strictly necessary. She stood under the water until it began to cool, and then she stood a little longer, in the specific luxury of hot water on a body that had been subsisting on cold well water and the occasional shower at Margaret's for the better part of 3 weeks. Small dignities matter. They accumulate. They are the difference between surviving a situation and actually living inside it. She was close to something. She could feel the shape of it from here, even if she couldn't see the full outline yet. Like bedroom's framing was solid. James had squared and plumbed it the same way he'd done everything, without shortcuts, and the insulation was already in place between the studs. What remained was the drywall. Bastarm. She ordered a delivery from Gary's on a Monday morning, 4x8 sheets, in 1/2 inch and 5/8 for the ceiling, and spent the afternoon of that same day hanging the first wall. Our first wall she hung had a visible bow in it, where she'd missed a stud, and the screw had pulled into empty space, leaving the sheet with a slight wave that would show through any paint applied over it. They pulled the sheet and re-hung it correctly. The second wall went up cleaner. By the 5th, she was working with the economical confidence of someone who has found the rhythm of a new skill and no longer has to think about the individual steps, about the work itself. The mud work was its own education. Her first attempt at taping and finishing the seams produced ridges she could see from across the room. She sanded. Applied another coat, thinner this time, extended further on each side, sanded again. The 5th pass on the joints, done by hand with a sanding block and a shop light held at a raking angle to reveal every imperfection the eye would otherwise miss, produced walls that would hold paint without betraying the seams beneath. She primed the room and painted it the same pale color as the first bedroom, the color from Gary's back shelf, the color her father had chosen and ordered and returned, and which had been waiting in Gary's storeroom, because Gary had set it aside, knowing that eventually the right person would come for it. The 2 rooms matched. She stood in the doorway of the 2nd bedroom after the 2nd coat dried and looked at it, and thought about what her father had written on page 11 of the notebook. Big enough for 2 bedrooms in case she ever needs more than herself. Bucketed. Plan for more than she can see from where she is now. He had not built the house for who she was at 19. He had built it for the person she might grow into, whoever that turned out to be, with room for the dimensions she couldn't yet measure. Unity of Ridgeton operated by its own information system, which was slower than the internet and more reliable. By the end of her 3rd week, people had begun to appear at the clearing on Miller Creek Road, arriving the way people in small places arrive at things, without formal announcement, without prior arrangement, as though the need had simply become known, and their presence was the natural response to a known need. Clark came on a Tuesday afternoon in her 4th week. He was 47, built compactly, with hands that bore the specific wear pattern of someone who had spent decades working with pipe and who had made peace with what that work costs a body. He introduced himself briefly at the edge of the clearing and then went directly to the house and asked if he could look at the plumbing. And she said yes, and he spent 90 minutes going over every joint and connection with the practiced attention of someone who has seen what happens when things are done almost correctly and has therefore developed a very clear idea of what correctly actually looks like. Found 2 places where her work needed reinforcement. A supply line connection, where the compression fitting was slightly under-tightened in a way that would hold indefinitely under normal conditions, but might fail under sustained pressure fluctuation, like a drain trap that was correctly assembled but had 1 degree too much flex at the wall connection. He found 3 places where James's original roughing was exceptional, better than new construction, slope on the drain lines precise to the 1/8 of an inch, as though he'd measured it with instruments rather than a level and a careful eye. "Your dad knew what he was doing," Timothy said, testing the compression fitting with a quarter turn that took him approximately 4 seconds. "These drainlines are textbook. I've seen licensed plumbers do sloppier, roughing. He was careful about everything." Olivia handed him the next fitting from the box on the floor. "About all of it, every part of it." Timothy tightened the fitting and tested it by feel, like the particular diagnostic touch of someone whose hands have accumulated enough knowledge that they can read what the eyes can't always see. Whatever he was building this for, he wasn't cutting corners on the bones of it, but take money when she offered it. He said James had helped him put up a storage building 2 springs ago and had refused anything for it, said neighbors helped neighbors, and this made them even. Olivia said she wasn't sure that math was right, and Timothy said it was the only math he was using, and that was the end of the negotiation. Edward Harris came the following Saturday morning. 69 years old, retired from 30 years of commercial electrical work. With the contained restless energy of someone whose body had stopped agreeing with full retirement, but whose mind had not finished working out the terms of the argument. Went through the panel first, checking the circuit labels against the runs in the walls. Laid 2 connections James had left slightly loose. The kind of thing that doesn't cause a problem until the first time the connection experiences significant heat load, and 1 circuit breaker rated 15 amps for a run that James had already wired in 12 gauge for 20, Edward said, holding the mismatched breaker in his open palm. He left a note. He pointed to a piece of masking tape on the inside of the panel door in James's block print. U-grade kitchen breaker to 20 before energizing ringage, and did his own electrical inspection. Made a punch list for whoever came after him. He replaced the breaker from a box of spares he'd brought without being asked. Play tools from a bag that suggested he had been doing exactly this kind of work his whole retired life, and had simply transferred the context from commercial buildings to neighbors' projects. They spent an hour afterward drinking coffee at the camp table and telling her about the time James had bought wire from him at a yard sale in 2019. An entire box of mixed-gauge cable that Edward had been about to put in the recycling bin. Paid me $40 for the lot. I thought he was going to resell it at a markup, which would have been fair enough. Edward turned the coffee cup in his hands, looking at something in the middle distance. Turns out he used every inch of it. I can see it in the walls right now. "My wire is in your house." There was something in how he said it. "My wire is in your house," that carried a weight beyond the statement's literal content, as though the wire being his and the house being hers was not a coincidence but a kind of inheritance, a connection established between 2 people who had never met through the medium of a man who had known them both and quietly arranged the world so that what each of them had would end up in the right place. The woman from the Baptist church came on a weekday afternoon, carrying a paper bag and wearing the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. Introduced herself as Loretta, and she pulled from the bag 2 sets of curtains she had made herself. White cotton with a narrow blue border, hemmed and pressed, and fitted to the dimensions of the east bedroom window. She said Gary Young had described the window to her. She said she thought a window like that deserved something in front of it that would move when the air came through. Jackson appeared on a Thursday when Olivia was restocking the paint mixing area at Gary's. She looked in the middle of the store floor to look Olivia with the direct recognition of someone who has been waiting for this encounter and has already decided how to handle it. "You're James's daughter." Olivia looked up from the display. The denim jacket, the dark hair, the posture of someone who had been to a funeral recently and was still carrying it in a particular set of the shoulders. "The woman from the back pew left a note on your chair," Olivia said. Donna looked slightly startled. "You found it. I kept it." Donna was quiet for a moment, recalibrating slightly. He fixed my display counter 4 years ago, the front counter at my shop on Elm Street. The one I was trying to put together myself when I first opened. Framed, leveled, trimmed, the whole job. He walked past the window, saw what I was doing, came in, eyed the whole thing in an afternoon. I tried to pay him. He said I looked like I needed the money more than he needed the job. A pause. He was right. I thought about it anyway. He was like that about a lot of things. Like that are rare. Donna looked at her with the frank directness of someone who does not traffic in unnecessary softening. I heard what you're doing out on Miller Creek Road. What do you need? A person who came had known James differently. Through a transaction, through a favor returned or offered, a brief exchange at Gary's counter on a Saturday morning when he was picking up materials on his way to a project nobody else knew about. They arrived carrying fragments of her father. It's a person she had known in the continuous intimacy of daily life, but had apparently not known in this other dimension, the dimension in which he moved through a community of people, quietly, over years, buying things because they needed doing, and because he was there to do them. She had known her father. She had also known only the version of her father available in their particular configuration, the father-daughter version, people in an apartment version. Here she was meeting the James Scott who existed when she wasn't in the room. She liked him. She was not surprised that she liked him, but she was moved by the specific texture of it, by the particular quality of a person you are only able to fully understand after they're gone. A will came to light in Gary's store on a Thursday morning in her 4th week, when she mentioned to Gary that she was going to need to establish her legal claim to the property formally before Ronald had time to pursue any kind of challenge. She said it, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has thought through a problem and arrived at the next required step, and Gary listened with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting to be asked. He reached under the main counter, past the receipt printer and the small radio he kept tuned to a country station at low volume all day, and he pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the counter between them. James came in on a Saturday about 3 months before he died, Ike said. He asked me and Brenda to witness a document, said he wanted it witnessed by people he trusted. Brenda was here that morning stocking the seed display, at the envelope on the counter with the careful placement of someone delivering something that matters. We signed. He took it to a notary that same week. The notarized copy got filed with the county clerk's office. Olivia opened the envelope. The document was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in James's block print, precise and clear as everything he wrote, as legible and deliberate as the map he'd drawn on the back of the deed. James Patrick Scott. Of sound mind and legal age, including all real property, to my daughter Olivia Ann Scott. This includes the property located at Lot 14, Miller Creek Road, Ridgeton, NC, below his signature, Gary D. Young's signature. Below that, Brenda L. Young's signature. Below that, a notary stamp dated 8 weeks before James died. Olivia held the paper and looked at the words for a long moment. I had known something might happen before the house was finished. Not because he was a superstitious man or a fearful man, but because he was a realistic man, a man who spent his working life doing physically demanding things with his body, and who understood that bodies have limits, and those limits can arrive without announcement. He had made the document real and registered and findable, but he had given her the legal ground to stand on before she knew she would need it. He mentioned Ronald, Gary said, in the tone of someone providing context rather than rendering judgment. Said, if Ronald knew there was property, arrive before the paint was dry. Olivia thought of the trailer backed into the Garner parking lot, the toolbox in 3 trips down the stairs, the kitchen table, the keys from the hook, the Bible on the shelf, left behind because it didn't look like it was worth anything. He knew, she said. Gary said nothing, which was exactly the right response. Some things don't need to be commented on. They just need to be acknowledged by 2 people who both understand them. She folded the document carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, next to the deed. She had $47 when she'd arrived in Ridgeton. I had considerably less than that now, the wages from Gary's just covering her food and the small incidental costs of daily life. But she had a deed and a will and a house she was making livable one task at a time. And that was a different kind of having than what she'd started with. Ronald came on a Thursday afternoon at the end of May. Olivia was on a ladder painting the window trim on the south wall, the finished side, the blue clapboard side, touching up a weather crack that had opened in the paint over the winter, when she heard it, the diesel engine, coming up the dirt track with the particular rhythm of a vehicle that knows a route. She heard it and she knew it. Finished the section of trim she was on before she climbed down. She wiped her brush on the edge of the paint can and set it across the lid, and she descended the ladder, and she stood at the base of it, and she waited. I'd been half expecting this. She had prepared for it the way you prepare for a thing you hope won't happen, but are not willing to be caught off guard by. Ronald parked at the edge of the clearing and got out, but different from the funeral. Thinner the way a person gets thinner from the inside out, rather than from reduced eating, the kind of reduction that happens when something structural shifts. He stood beside the truck and looked at the house, at the finished blue siding, at the new roof, at the framed porch, at the three-quarters done state of a thing that was clearly becoming what it had always been going to be. Looked at Olivia. What the hell is this flat? Not a question. The statement of a man who knows what he's looking at and is experiencing the specific discomfort of something that contradicts his accounting of the world. It's my house. Eggled walked toward her with the forward momentum of a man accustomed to being the largest factor in any given situation. He looked at the south wall, at the clapboard in the pale blue she had touched up that morning, looked at the cedar stack under the top. He did the arithmetic of what he was seeing, and something moved in his face that was not calculation and not surprise but something between them. He never told me he had land. He didn't tell anyone. I'm his brother. The weight Ronald put on those two words carried 20 years in it, not just the present complaint. Olivia felt something settle in her chest. Not anger. She had been expecting anger and found something steadier instead. Particular composure that comes when you have imagined a moment many times and have decided who you're going to be inside it. He left a will, witnessed, notarized, filed with the county clerk. Everything he owned goes to me. The land, like the house. All of it. Ronald went very still. He was looking for the angle. She could see it. The place where the logic was soft, where a different arrangement of the facts might give him ground. Gary's signature was on the document, and Gary was known in this town, and the notary stamp was real, and the filing was registered, and the county clerk's office had a copy. I'll get a lawyer, Ronald said. But the conviction had already left it before the words finished arriving. Get one. Her voice was even, not cold, not dismissive, the flat factual tone of someone who has thought through what she's saying before saying it. Don't win this. He built that document the same way he built everything else. No shortcuts. Ronald looked at her for a long time. Anger in his face moved through something and came out the other side as something quieter and harder to name, something that had been waiting behind the anger for a long time and was only now finding enough space to be visible. Looked at the house, at the pale blue of the south wall, at that specific shade that was not an accident, that her father had chosen from a catalogue with the same deliberateness with which he chose everything. At the porch frame, at the stack of cedar under the top waiting to become a railing. He should have told me, Ronald said. Quieter now. Something different in it. You took his tools, his truck, our kitchen table, she said it, without accusation. Just inventory, like the way you state facts that are beyond dispute. I don't know what you were expecting him to tell you. Arnold looked at her the way he'd looked at the house. The way you look at something that is real and present and more complete than you had prepared yourself for. You look like him, he said, standing there like that, ate in the truck and drove out of the clearing, and she stood where she was until the engine sound faded completely into the pine trees. Then she picked up her paintbrush and went back up the ladder. Olivia. That evening she sat on Margaret's porch and told her about the visit, and Margaret listened with the attention of someone who has been expecting exactly this, and has already decided how she feels about it. Ronald came, Olivia said, the truck going past. Margaret held her coffee cup in both hands. What did he want? What he always wants. But there's nothing to get. The will held. Margaret looked out at her field, right where the winter wheat had grown tall and was moving in the evening wind in long, slow waves. Your father told me once, sitting right where you're sitting, that if Ronald ever found out about the land, he'd lawyer up before the paint was dry. He loved his brother. He also knew exactly what his brother was. Those two things lived together in him the same way. Two things that don't resolve can still both be true. Olivia looked at the field and sat with that for a while, loving someone and knowing what they are. How those two things can occupy the same chest without resolving into either forgiveness or rejection or any clean ending. My mother left when I was 3, she said. She hadn't planned to say it, but came out with the particular ease of something that has been held in one position for too long and shifts when the pressure is right. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She let the statement sit in the air between them. Right was the right thing. He never talked about her. When I asked when I was little, he'd change the subject, and eventually I stopped asking. She looked at her coffee. I grew up thinking she left because she didn't want to be there, that staying wasn't worth the effort. I filled in the blank with the worst version, because nobody gave me a different one. Maybe he was protecting something, Margaret said quietly. Maybe. She let the maybe rest. It was all she had. Walked back to the house that night in the dark, which she had gotten comfortable with. The 1.5 miles from Margaret's, along the ridge road to the gravel, down the gravel to the track, through the pines to the clearing. Pint walked beside her the whole way, at his customary 2 inches of careful distance. He had begun appearing at Margaret's whenever Olivia arrived there, and walking home with her when she left. Pat stopped questioning because the pattern had established itself beyond any decision she'd made about it. I was at the camp table in the kitchen that night, reading back through the notebook for what must have been the 8th or 9th time, when she noticed the box. I had been using the metal tin as a paperweight at one corner of the camp table for days, weighting down the edge of her materials list while she worked. The tin was a rectangular cookie tin, the kind with a hinged lid, painted red with a floral pattern that was almost entirely worn away from handling. She had registered it as a piece of James's camp equipment, the same category as the lantern and the enamel mug and the folded tarp. I had not examined it more closely. She didn't know why she opened it on that particular night. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands and lifted the lid. Inside, a neat stack of papers, rubber-banded, organized chronologically the way James organized everything. She removed the rubber band and sorted through them. Receipts. 84 of them, she counted. Suppliers and lumber yards and hardware stores. The first weekend in April 2018 through the previous month. Cedar siding, roofing nails. The east bedroom window, $41 at a salvage yard, dated 3 years back. The water heater connection parts, itemized. I6 lumber in quantity, flooring, drywall by the sheet, joint compound, weight. 2 quarts of white primer, and 1 quart of something labeled only by a color code that she recognized immediately because she had seen the same code on the can Gary Young had found in his storeroom and given her without explanation beyond the minimum necessary. Added the receipts up on the back of an envelope with a pencil, working through the columns twice to confirm the number, $14,212. 7 years, $14,000. Entirety of what was left after rent and food, and the basic costs of a man who spent nothing on himself that wasn't strictly necessary. She had seen it in his boots, which he'd resoled twice rather than replace. In the truck, maintained with the fastidious care of someone who cannot afford a mechanical failure. In the way he'd shopped the salvage yards and the garage sales and the store closing sales, buying what was good at the price it was available, rather than new at the price it should have been. He had given the whole surplus of his life to this. Every dollar that hadn't been spoken for by necessity had gone into this clearing, this house, into the specific future he was building for a daughter who didn't know it was being built. Under the receipts, knotted between the last one and the bottom of the tin, an envelope, old, yellow at the edges. The gum seal intact, sealed, she couldn't tell which. On the front, in handwriting that was not James's, smaller, rounder, the careful hand of someone who had learned penmanship as a discipline. James, Olivia held the envelope without opening it for a long time. Overhead pendant light was warm and steady. Flint was sleeping in the corner of the finished bedroom, audible through the interior door as a gentle rhythmic breathing. Outside the kitchen window frame, the night was the particular deep quiet of this place. The quiet that had texture and weight rather than just the absence of sound. She opened the envelope. The paper inside was thin, lined, a kind torn from a legal pad, and it was filled with the same small, neat handwriting as the address on the outside. The ink was faded at the edges but clear at the center. The date at the top was 15 years ago. Hi, James. I know you won't write back. I know you're angry, and I don't blame you for being angry. But I need you to know the reason I was diagnosed in February. Early onset MSA, multiple system atrophy. The pathologist I saw said I had probably 8 to 10 good years before the disease would begin to take away the things I use to be a person in the world. To walk, to lift, the things you do when you're raising a small child who needs to be carried and chased and steadied when she's scared. I was 27 years old. Olivia was 3. I couldn't stay and be the version of me that was disappearing in front of her. I couldn't let her grow up watching that. I saw my own aunt go through this same disease, and I know what the end of it looks like. I made a decision that was not a cowardly decision, even though I understand why it looks like one from where you're standing. Please don't tell her I'm sick. Let her be angry at me for leaving. Anger is something a child can carry. It's useful. It aids her somewhere to put the energy of missing something. Pity just takes up space and doesn't go anywhere. I left because I loved her enough to understand that my presence would eventually cost her more than my absence. I'm sorry. Sandra Olivia read the letter once. Then she put it down on the table and pressed her palms flat on the surface on either side of it and breathed slowly and deliberately until the initial movement of something through her chest. Not grief, not the grief she already knew. Something different, a grief that had been filed under a different label for 15 years, and was only now revealing what it had always actually been, had passed through enough that she could see past it. Her mother had not left because she didn't want to be there. Her mother had left because her body was going to make her leave anyway, and she had chosen to do it while she still had the agency to choose. She had chosen to do it in a way that gave Olivia something she could live inside. Anger, which is active, which moves forward, which requires energy and momentum, rather than something that would freeze her in place, watching someone disappear. She had made a wrong decision. Olivia could see that clearly. She could see the wrongness of it without the wrongness, cancelling the love that had produced it. Both things were true at the same time, and holding both did not require resolving them into a single, cleaner feeling. There was a second envelope under the first, newer paper. The seal broken and retaped carefully, and James had read this one and then sealed it back the way you seal something you are keeping, rather than discarding. The second letter was dated 9 years after the first. 6 years ago, James, I don't know if you read my first letter. I don't know if you'll read this one either. But I'm writing because I've moved and I want you to know where I am in case something happens to me and Olivia ever wants to find out. I'm at the Greenfield Care Center in Bristol, Virginia, room 214. Legs stopped working reliably 18 months ago. My right hand shakes when I try to do fine work, which means I type more than I write. I can still write if I go slowly, which is how I'm writing this. AM told me Olivia graduated high school. I don't know who told me or how they knew to tell me, and I didn't ask because I was too busy crying to ask questions. I cried for the better part of an afternoon. She graduated. You did that. Paid that. I also heard that you've been working on something for years. Something you're building. I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking you to tell me, but if it's for her, I want you to know that I think it's right. The only right thing either of us can do from here is make sure she has what she needs to build a life on solid ground. I don't expect to hear back. Sandra. Olivia sat at the camp table in the kitchen. Her father had almost finished and held both letters and looked at them. James had read these letters. They had kept them in the bottom of a tin box under 84 receipts for the construction of a house he was building for the daughter of the woman who had written them. He had not responded, or if he had, the response was not here. Ott told Olivia. He had honored the request in the first letter. Let her be angry, Anger is something a child can carry. He had let her be angry for 15 years. And then he had built her a house. Her mother was in Bristol, Virginia, Plainfield Care Center, room 214. 6 years had passed since that second letter. She could be somewhere different now. She could be gone. The disease could have taken other things in the intervening years. There was no way to know without reaching out, and she was not ready to reach out tonight, not in this kitchen, not with the paint still fresh on the bedroom walls, and the porch still missing its railing, and the front door still a sheet of plywood on a padlock. She put both letters back in their envelopes and put the envelopes in the tin and closed the lid, went into the finished room and lay down on the cot in the dark. Through the east window, the stars were where they always were, steady and indifferent and very far away. Flint breathed in the corner. The house around her was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that is still becoming what it is. She thought about anger, about the years she had kept it and the specific texture of it, the way it had been both ballast and burden at the same time, the way a thing you carry for long enough becomes part of how you walk. She thought about a 27-year-old woman making a choice from inside a diagnosis she was terrified of. A year before, Olivia was old enough to remember any of it. She thought about her father, who had known for 15 years and had carried it in a tin box under a stack of receipts and had said nothing and had built her a house instead. I did not feel resolution. She did not feel forgiveness, not in any clean or complete sense. She felt the edges of something she couldn't name yet, a shape that was too large and too complicated to be a single feeling, require more time than one night to understand. But she was here. She was in the house. Both of those things were true, and they would still be true in the morning, and that was enough for tonight. She closed her eyes, and the house settled around her in the dark, and she slept. Part 3. The second bedroom's paint dried overnight, and in the morning the room smelled like fresh latex, and the particular mineral smell of a space that has been sealed and is now breathing differently than it did before. Olivia stood in the doorway with her coffee and looked at it in the early light. The pale color on all four walls, the unglazed window opening on the north face, still covered with plastic sheeting, the bare subfloor waiting for whatever would eventually cover it. And she thought about what her father had written on page 11. Big enough for 2 bedrooms in case she ever needs more than herself. A plan for more than she can see from where she is now. She could not see very far from where she was. She was aware of this as a fact rather than a complaint. 19 years old, 11 weeks into a project that had started with $47 and a deed, living in a house with no front door and 1 finished room and a second bedroom that was now painted but otherwise still a question mark. Not seeing far was appropriate to the position. What she could see was the next task, and the task after that, and the general shape of the work remaining, and that was enough to move through a day. A gutter on the north side of the house needed cleaning. Debris from the winter had clogged the downspout and water was backing up under the eave, which was the kind of thing that becomes expensive if you let it go long enough. Out with it on a Tuesday morning, before her shift at Gary's, up a ladder with a garden trowel borrowed from Margaret, wasting 4 all, pulling out the packed leaves and pine needles by the handful and dropping them into the clearing below where they would decompose into whatever the clearing wanted them to become. Act was unglamorous, and her arms were tired by the end of it, and the water ran clear through the downspout when she flushed it with the hose, which was the only thing that mattered. She fixed Margaret's porch railing on a Saturday. Had been mentally preparing for this job for 2 weeks, going over it in the way she'd learned to go over unfamiliar work. Visualizing the steps in sequence, identifying the places where she'd need to make decisions she couldn't fully predict in advance, thinking about what tools she'd need and in what order. Margaret's railing had 4 rotted posts that needed replacing, and a top rail that had come loose at 2 of its connections, and an overall lean to the south that suggested the footing on 1 corner post had shifted. She pulled the rotted posts first, working carefully to preserve the existing ledger board where the rail attached to the house. The new posts were cedar from the stack under the tarp at the Lot 14 site, loaded into Margaret's truck the previous weekend. The same cedar James had bought for the railing he'd planned to build. in exchange for the water heater, the cedar that had been waiting under the tarp for this precise use. They set the posts in tube forms with concrete, let them cure for 2 days, and came back on Monday to hang the rail sections and add the intermediate balusters. Margaret supervised from her porch chair with a cup of coffee. In practice meant she pointed out every imperfection in a tone that was simultaneously critical and affectionate, the tone of someone who has high standards and is pleased to have something worth applying them to. That baluster's not plumb. Olivia checked it with the torpedo level. It's within an eighth. James would have made it plumb. James had 7 years of practice. She adjusted the baluster and rechecked. Dead plumb. Better? Better. A pause in which Margaret sipped her coffee. He would have done the same thing. Fixed it without arguing about it. I argued about it. Yes, but you fixed it. Margaret looked at the railing with the expression of someone noting that a thing is exactly what it should be. That's the part that matters. The railing was done by early afternoon. Olivia stood on the porch and put her weight against the top rail at several points, testing the rigidity, checking for any movement in the post connections. Solid. She had not rushed the concrete cure, and the posts were not going anywhere. Margaret ran her hand along the top rail. Then she looked at Olivia with something that was not quite approval, because approval would have implied uncertainty, and Margaret was not uncertain. It was something more like recognition, of someone who sees a thing correctly done and acknowledges it as such. Your father would have been satisfied, Margaret said, which from Margaret was the highest available rating. That evening, Olivia walked back to Lot 14 along the ridge road in the last of the afternoon light, Flint at her side, and she thought about satisfied, about what it meant to do a thing to the standard where satisfied was the right word. Perfect. Perfect was a different category, a category that belonged to ideals rather than to work done by human hands in real conditions. Satisfied meant the work held up to honest examination. It meant nothing was hidden, nothing was fudged, nothing would fail in a year and make you wish you'd spent another hour on it. Her father had spent 7 years building to that standard. She was learning to recognize it from the inside. Arnold came back on a morning in late June. Not the aggressive return she'd half been watching for. No trailer, no Sharon, no engine revving up the dirt track with the energy of someone who has retained legal counsel and arrived prepared for a fight. Oh, just the truck, moving slowly, parking at the edge of the clearing, with the diffident care of someone who isn't sure of their welcome and is trying to be honest about that uncertainty rather than override it with forward momentum. Sat in the cab for almost 2 full minutes before he got out. Olivia was on the porch, which now had a railing, the cedar posts and top rail she'd fitted and sanded the previous week, tucked to the existing porch frame with the same care she brought to everything now, the care that had become automatic rather than effortful. And she watched him sit in the truck. She waited. He looked different from the confrontation in May, still but differently thin. The May thinness had been tight and compressed, anger held under pressure. This was something looser, unwound. The look of a man who has been maintaining a particular shape for a long time and has stopped. Paper in his shirt pocket was folded into a small rectangle, visible at the breast pocket edge. She recognized it without being able to read it. The format, the color, the specific size of a document from an institution that requires a response, a court notice, or a collections letter, the kind of paper that arrives and changes the weight of your pocket. He got out of the truck and walked toward the porch without hurrying. He stopped at the base of the steps, which still did not exist, the porch still suspended 3 feet above the ground with nothing connecting it to the earth below. And he looked up at her. I'm not here about the property, flat, direct, not defensive. A statement of someone who has decided to say the true thing rather than the protected thing. Olivia leaned against the new railing. Okay? Sharon left. He said it the way you say something you have been practicing saying, the way a difficult piece of information becomes bearable, only after you have repeated it enough times that your own voice has gotten used to carrying it. 3 weeks ago. Said I'd been getting meaner and wasn't showing signs of improvement. They've quiet in the clearing, birds somewhere in the pines, the distant sound of a vehicle on the main road, too far away to be anything specific. She wasn't wrong, Ronald said. Olivia waited. She had learned in these past weeks a particular value of waiting, of letting a silence stay a silence until the person inside it decides what to do next. Trying to fill it for them was a form of interference. However well-intentioned, the paper in his shirt pocket was a glitch she would learn later in the conversation. Notice from a collections court regarding a debt Ronald had accrued separately from anything involving James. A loan he had co-signed for a business venture 4 years ago that had failed quietly and whose failure had been quietly producing consequences ever since. The truck he had taken from the Garner apartment was listed as an asset in the collections proceeding, which meant the truck was no longer available to him as an asset, which meant it had been processed into a number in a legal document and was gone. Arrived in a borrowed truck. "I've been thinking about what I did," Ronald said, after the funeral. The tools, the keys. He looked at the porch boards above him rather than at her face. The table didn't help him by saying it was all right. Because it wasn't all right, and the only useful path through the thing was to let him say what he'd come to say without her managing the landing for him. "Like James didn't owe me $4,000, he said. "I owed him. I've owed him for 20 years. Different amounts at different times, never paid back. He never asked for it back. He never made it a thing between us." He kept answering the phone when I called. His voice shifted on the last sentence. A small change in register that he immediately controlled, the control itself telling. "And after I made it worse. Wasn't there to say anything about it." Olivia looked at him. He had the same jaw she did, the same forward way of carrying his shoulders that she'd seen on her own face in the bathroom mirror, often enough to recognize it in someone else. An inheritance of a family she hadn't chosen and couldn't undo, the way blood works regardless of what you do with it. "I sold the welding rig," Ronald said. "Got $800 for it. I want to give that to you. Keep it." Looked up at her. "What, you need it more than I do?" Not cruel, not gentle, just factual, the way she had learned to say things. "And money isn't what you came here for anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, achy. Something in his face worked through several expressions before settling into something that was not quite recognition, but was in the same neighborhood. The look of someone who has been seen accurately is deciding whether to be grateful or defensive about it. "He built all this by himself," Ronald said, looking at the house now the way he hadn't in May, when he'd been cataloging its value, looking at it now the way you look at something that makes demands on you, that asks you to become the kind of person who can receive it correctly. 7 years, 7 years, I didn't know he had it in him." He stopped. Started again. "I knew he was good with his hands, but this is another stop. This is a whole life someone built in here." Olivia looked at the house too, at the pale blue of the south wall, and the framed porch, and the window that would catch the morning light on the east face. At the things her father had built with the money he had not spent on new boots, or a quieter truck, or any of the small comforts she had occasionally tried to push him toward, and he had consistently declined. "It's love," she said, but planned to say it. It came out with the ease of something that has been understood for a while and is finally being put into words. That's what it is. 7 years of Saturdays, $14,000. That's what love looks like when someone decides to make it into a physical object. Ronald didn't answer. He looked at the steps that weren't there. The empty space between the porch floor and the ground, vast structural gap in the front of the house. The thing that would make the threshold accessible, that would connect the interior life of the house to the earth it sat on. "You need stairs," he said finally. 3 steps. "Lumber's in the shed." Looked at her. She looked back. "Can you run a circular saw?" she said. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last and not a moment longer. "Yeah," Ronald said. "I can run a saw." Worked for 3 hours in the morning heat, without speaking much beyond the language of the work itself. "Hand me that. Check the level. Mark it here. This piece needs another pass with the plane." Passing head, Ronald measured and cut the stringers while Olivia cut the treads to length, and he worked with a precision she hadn't expected, and then immediately should have, because this was the same blood, the same hands, same fundamental understanding of how materials behave when you pay attention to them. The 3 steps went in solid. Plumb at the sides, level at each nosing. Olivia stood on the top step, and put her weight on it in sequence across all three corners. Nothing flexed. Ronald sat down on the bottom step with the particular exhausted ease of a man whose body has remembered something it had not used in a while. He accepted the water bottle she handed him and drank half of it. "Would have stood here for 10 minutes checking the gap at the stringer," Ronald said. "He would have found something wrong with it. Then he would have fixed whatever he found and said it was perfect." The silence between them after that was different from the silence before it. Not cautious, not loaded. The silence of two people occupying the same space, without having resolved everything between them and having found on a provisional basis they could occupy the space anyway. Which was not resolution, but it was a beginning of something, if Ronald decided to make it one. He stood after a while. He looked at the house one more time, the whole of it, at the south wall and the east face and the north side still in plywood, and the porch they'd just made accessible. Looked at it with an expression she could only describe as reckoning. The specific look of someone who is adjusting their understanding of a person they thought they knew, and finding that the adjustment is larger than they'd prepared for. "Come back," Olivia said. "If you want to." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He walked to the borrowed truck and drove out of the clearing. She watched the dust settle after he'd gone, and then she went inside and made lunch and thought about what it meant to build 3 steps compared to what it meant to build 7 years, and whether the difference could ever be bridged, and decided that the question wasn't whether it could be bridged, but whether you were willing to start. Face it, Gary brought the exterior paint on a Monday morning. She was restocking the seed display when he came through the back door of the store carrying a quart can, the kind with a dried drip on the side that meant it had been opened and carefully resealed by someone who intended to come back to it. "Found this in the back corner of the storeroom," Gary said, setting it on the counter beside the register. "Musninsta returned it last year. Wrong color," they said. "It's been sitting there since." She looked at the can. The label had the store's color-matching sticker on the lid, and under the sticker was the manufacturer's color code. Recognized the code because she had seen it twice before. Once on the interior bedroom paint can Gary had found in the same storeroom, and once in James's notebook on page 17, where he had written the code next to the notation, "Exterior, same color, match the bedroom. She'll want the inside and outside to feel like the same place." Her father had thought about the inside and the outside of the house matching. They had thought about how it would feel to be in the finished bedroom and look out the east window at the exterior wall, and have them be the same color, the same blue, lavender, so that the boundary between inside and outside would be minimized in the way that a house minimizes boundaries when it's built by someone who is thinking about what it will feel like to live in it. James bought a quart of this same color about 4 months before he died, Gary said in the measured tone of someone who has decided to tell the full truth because anything less would be a failure of respect. For the exterior, returned it the following week because the substrate wasn't ready. He was waiting on the south wall to have another season of weathering before he painted it. He was particular about the surface prep. Trying to put paint on something that hadn't fully settled, he returned it. And then this can came back as a return. I set it aside when it came in. Harry picked up his stocking sheet and moved to the next display without making anything more of it. "Take it." She painted the exterior over 6 days. Up at first light on the ladder before the heat arrived, section by section around all 4 sides of the house. The south wall was already clapboard and already in the right blue, but needed touching up and a full second coat where the weather had opened small cracks over the winter. The north and east and west walls were the plywood substrate, protected by the house wrap James had stapled over it, and the surface was sound and stable, ready for the primer she applied first on each section before the top coat, a thin coats the way the notation on page 19 specified. The color went on as she had known it would. The pale blue that occupied the hour before the sky made up its mind to be fully daytime, in between blue that her father had ordered from a catalog, and returned and kept the code for, and that Gary had set it aside in the back storeroom. Because he was the kind of man who set things aside when he understood why they might matter. Watched the house transform section by section as she worked around it, like the plywood gray, disappearing under the color that had been chosen specifically for this surface by a man who had spent years thinking about what this house was for and who it was for and what it should feel like when the person it was for came home to it. Like she had finished the final wall and descended the ladder for the last time and walked to the tree line to look at the whole thing from a distance. House was one color on all four sides. Pale blue in the afternoon light, looked small and complete, and surrounded by the cleared grass of the clearing and the pine trees beyond it. It looked like a place someone lived, because someone did. She took a photograph on her phone and looked at it for a long moment, like standing at the tree line with Flint beside her. Then she put her phone in her pocket and picked up the ladder and carried it back to the shed and put it away. Ronald came back the following week with Cedar in the bed of the borrowed truck, arrived without announcement, which she had stopped expecting him not to do, and he stood at the base of the 3 steps he'd built the previous visit and said, "Hienya kundan lan kan," he said it in English. "Porch needs a railing." Looked at him. "I have one. The one you built is good for the function. Cedar's better for the finish." He tilted his head at the truck bed. "Found it at a salvage yard near where I'm staying. Good wood, matches what you've got on the frame." She looked at the cedar in the truck bed, clear grain, tight rings, the color of something that had been properly dried and was ready for the work. She looked at Ronald, standing in the posture of someone who is offering something and is not certain whether the offer will be accepted and has decided to make it anyway. "All right," she said. They worked 2 days on the railing. Arnold was more precise than she'd expected, and she kept expecting it, kept revising her expectations upward as she watched his hands on the cedar. He mitted the corners cleanly on the first try. He countersank every screw to exactly the right depth. Like he sanded each post section with the progressive grit attention of someone who understands that the finish is part of the structure, that what the wood feels like when you run your hand along it is not separate from whether it does its job. They didn't talk much while they worked. What they said was the language of the task. 2 inches from the edge, test that connection. This post needs a half shim at the base. The silence between the task language was different from any silence they'd previously shared, which had always carried some residue of what wasn't being said. This silence was just the silence of work, of 2 people who both know what they're doing and don't need to narrate it. On the second afternoon, when the last post was set and the top rail was going on, Ronald held the rail in position while Olivia drove the screws. They said without preamble, "How much did he spend on all of this?" "The receipts in the tin go to $14,212. Ronald was quiet for a moment. Over 7 years. Over 7 years. That's everything he made after rent and food." Yes, he held the rail without speaking while she drove the last 2 screws. Then she stepped back and checked the level and the connection at the post, and the rail was true and solid and would hold weight without complaint for longer than either of them would be around to test it. "Like the same pair of boots for 4 years, Ronald said. "I remember because I asked him once why he didn't get new ones, and he said the old ones were fine. They weren't fine." "No," Ronald said, "they weren't," but didn't say anything else about it. He picked up his tools and put them in the bag and stood at the top of the 3 steps he'd built and looked out at the clearing for a long moment, ailing on Margaret Wilson's porch that needs replacing. "Olivia," said Ronald, looked at her. "She's 2 miles east. She gave Dad the hot water heater. He was going to do her railing in exchange. He never got to it." Looked at him steadily. "I did the posts and the basic structure last week. The finish work needs more time than I have right now." Ronald picked up his bag. "Saturday?" "Saturday." Overway, and she stood on the finished porch with its cedar railing, and she put both hands on the top rail and leaned her weight against it, and it held without any movement at all. Liked the way a thing holds when it has been built correctly by someone paying attention to what they were doing. And she thought about what it meant that Ronald had come back twice now, with his hands and his tools and his careful mitered corners, and she decided that the meaning of it was still being established, and it was too early to name it definitively. And that was all right. Wrote the letter on a Thursday evening in late July, 3 weeks before the house was finished. 4 months, and 2 days after she had stepped off the bus in Ridgeton with $47 and a deed. Wrote it in the state of almost finished, which felt right. Not from completion. From the last stretch of the work, from the position of someone who could see the end clearly and had not yet arrived at it. I had walked past the post office on her way back from Gary's 4 times in the previous 2 weeks without going in. The 5th time she went in, the letter was 2 pages. She wrote it by hand at the kitchen table. The camp table was gone now, replaced by a proper table she'd built from leftover lumber, the same way her father built everything, from what was available and what was needed, and then she copied it onto stationery she bought at the Ridgeton Pharmacy, also the only place in town that sold stationery. Alongside the blood pressure monitors and the reading glasses, she told Sandra who she was, though Sandra knew who she was. She told her about the house. I described it the way you describe a place to someone who cannot see it, with the specific details that convey what it is rather than just what it looks like. The east window and what it let in the mornings, the shelf at her exact height on the south wall of the bedroom, the pale blue of the exterior that matched the color of the bedroom, and the color she had described to her father, once as the sky, when it can't decide yet whether to be morning or not. Described the bathroom tile and the kitchen window her father had put over the sink because, if he knew she stood at windows when she washed things and should have something to look at. Described the 2 Adirondack chairs she'd bought at a yard sale for $12 total and placed on the porch facing south, because the notebook said the porch should face south and hold 2 chairs. She told Sandra that James was gone, had died in March, and that she hadn't found the land until the same week, and that she had arrived at this house with $47 and a deed and had spent the summer finishing what he had started. Told her that James had kept both letters, that she had found them in the tin box under the receipts, that she understood, as much as she was able to understand, what Sandra had been trying to do when she left. Told her she wasn't ready to visit. She wrote it plainly, without apology. Not yet. She didn't know when she would be ready, or whether she ever fully would be, and she wasn't going to promise something she couldn't be certain of. Wanted Sandra to know she was here. She wanted Sandra to know that her father had built her a house, the way Sandra had hoped he would, and that the house was almost done. She sealed the envelope, addressed it to the Greenfield Care Center in Bristol, Virginia, room 214. She added her return address, Lot 14, Miller Creek Road, Ridgeton, NC. On her way to Gary's the next morning, she stopped at the post office and slid the envelope through the brass mail slot in the door. The slot was worn smooth from decades of use, and the letter made a clean sound going through it. And that was that. Letter into the unknown, the same way Sandra had sent hers 15 years ago. Into the uncertainty of whether it would reach the right person, and whether the right person would respond, and what that response would look like if it came. She walked the rest of the way to Gary's, with her hands in her jacket pockets, and the particular lightness of having done a necessary thing. The front door was the last major piece, but found it at a salvage architectural shop 40 minutes south of Ridgeton, at the end of a state highway that wound through countryside that looked as it had looked for 100 years and seemed to have no intention of changing. The shop was in an old tobacco barn whose interior was dim and cool and smelled of old wood and mineral spirits, its inventory organized by a system that was intuitive to the owner and opaque to everyone else, and you had to look at everything and could not go directly to what you wanted, which meant you found things you hadn't known you were looking for. The door was solid core oak, 36 by 80, had been painted over several times, white at some point, then green, then a dark red that had chipped at the edges to show the previous colors beneath it like geological layers. The vendor wanted $40, $35 because she asked and he considered it and agreed, and the door was worth more than either of them was paying for it, which is the best possible outcome of a negotiation. She spent a full day stripping it. Light gun was Gary's, borrowed from the equipment shelf in the store's back room, and she worked outside in the clearing in the morning light, each paint layer in long curling strips that revealed the layer below until she reached the wood itself, straight-grained red oak, tight and dense, a figure that emerges in quarter-sawn boards and that no amount of paint over multiple decades had been able to diminish. She sanded it the following morning, working through the grits in sequence. The surface was smooth enough to catch and hold light evenly across its full face. 3 coats of oil-based polyurethane. Each coat a full day to cure in the August heat. She used the curing time productively. Finished the kitchen countertop installation, the butcher block panels cut to length and fitted to the cabinet tops, sanded, and finished with mineral oil. She worked into the grain until the wood darkened and opened and became something you wanted to touch. Hung the cabinet doors, adjusted the hinges until every door sat level, and swung without complaint. Installed the kitchen faucet, connecting the supply lines with the competence of someone who has done this kind of work enough times that it is no longer intimidating, only careful. The day Gary came to help hang the door was the 2nd week of August. The clearing was in the thick light of high summer, and the air smelled like pine and cut grass. Ike arrived at 7 in the morning with his toolbox and a set of mortise hinges, and the particular energized purposefulness of a man who understands that he has come to do the last piece of a significant thing. They worked methodically. Harry shimmed the rough frame until the opening was plumb on both sides and level at the head, adjusting each shim in small increments and checking with the 4-foot level and checking again. The hinges went in on the jamb side first, placed in with the sharp chisel Gary had brought from the store, the cuts made precisely so the hinges sat flush with the surface and would not bind. When they lifted the door into the opening and set the hinge pins, their door swung on its first try. Clean arc, no binding at the top or bottom, the gap at the threshold even on both sides. Gary fitted the latch hardware while Olivia held the door steady. When he stepped back and she released the door, it stayed exactly where she'd left it, the latch plate engaging cleanly with the strike. Gary stepped back and looked at it, eyes quiet for a moment in the way of a person who is receiving something, rather than formulating a response to it. "That's a house," he said. "That right there is a finished house." Olivia stood at the threshold and looked through the open door at the interior. The kitchen counter and the pendant light and the hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom, all of it finished, all of it functional. It arrived at, through 14 weeks and $14,000 of her father's life and the knowledge and labor of people who had known him in ways she was still discovering. Locked the door from the inside with the deadbolt Gary had installed, heard the click of it, a specific sound that meant a specific thing. She unlocked it and opened it and stood on the porch. Gary picked up his toolbox. "Hasty, your dad would have stood here 10 minutes checking the gap on the hinge side, and then he would have found something and fixed it. And then he would have said it was exactly right." Looked at the door one more time with the expression of a man who knew James Scott and is recognizing something of him in what he is looking at. And he would have been correct. She walked through the house alone after Gary left. Not the walk of active problem-solving, not the walk of someone cataloging what remained. The walk of completion, which is its own particular thing. The walk you take when there is nothing left to fix, and the thing simply is what it is. Kitchen, the butcher block counter with its mineral oil finish, the window over the sink framing the view north across the clearing, the pendant light above, the cabinet doors all level and swinging right, bathroom, the tile floor, the vanity, our curtain rod, the mirror with the small chip in the corner that she'd bought at the thrift store in Rocky Mount, because it was $3 and worked. First bedroom, east-facing window, the curtains from Loretta at the Baptist church moving slightly in the air that came through the summer gap at the frame, the bed from Margaret's barn, the shelf on the south wall at exactly her height. She took the notebook down from the shelf and opened it to the last page of her father's writing, and she read the last 4 words one more time. Then she turned past page 23 to her own entries, which began on page 24 on the day she arrived and had continued through 29 pages since. Read back through them the way you reread a document that has been recording something you were too close to see while it was happening. 23 pages in her father's hand, 29 in hers, 52 pages, 2 voices, 1 house, accessible. The gathering happened on a Saturday at the end of August. Margaret organized it because Margaret understood that certain completions are not only private events but communal ones. Stated that the people who have participated in making a thing should be present when the thing is declared, made, and that food is the right medium for this kind of acknowledgement. Made pot roast and brought it in the cast-iron braising pot in the back of her green truck. Gary and Brenda brought a salted caramel pie from a recipe Brenda described as older than she was. Timothy Clark and his wife brought potato salad and sweet tea. Edward Harris brought cornbread wrapped in a dish towel. Loretta from the Baptist church brought the kitchen curtains she had made. White cotton with the blue border, related to the kitchen window dimensions she had measured herself one Tuesday afternoon while Olivia was at the store and Flint supervised. And a second set for the second bedroom window, for when it eventually got glazed. Faith Jackson brought brownies and a box of coffee that was better than anything else in the house, and which she left with the air of someone who has decided that some gifts don't require discussion. Ronald came. He arrived late, at which she suspected was deliberate. The choice of someone who understands that his presence requires a particular kind of entry, a certain amount of space to establish itself before it becomes simply part of what is happening. At the edge of the group for a few minutes, at the base of the 3 steps he had built on his first return visit. Then Margaret appeared beside him with a plate of food and said, "Sit down, Ronald. You built the steps and the railing. That earns you a plate," which was both an invitation and an accounting, delivered in Margaret's characteristically direct style, and he accepted both and sat down, right on the porch and in the clearing, because the house was not large enough for everyone at once, and the August evening was warm enough that being outside was not a hardship, but an amenity. A conversation was the comfortable, overlapping kind that happens when people who know each other partially are discovering the shapes of each other's stories in the context of a shared thing. They talked about James, about the Saturday mornings, about the specific way he'd worked, about the care with which he'd approached each task, about the things each of them had noticed about him during the 7 years he'd been coming through this part of the county on his way to a project nobody else had known about. She heard stories she hadn't heard before. Exeter. About the Saturday 3 years in when James had arrived to find one wall of the house damaged by a fallen branch that had come through the plastic sheeting during a storm, baked and had spent half the day in the rain repairing the damage before he could build anything new. About the time he'd cut a window opening 2 inches too narrow on the first attempt, and had spent an extra half day removing the mistake and reframing it correctly without damaging the surrounding structure. Small stories, the texture of the work, like the specific difficulties and solutions that compose any real-made thing. Ronald listened. She watched him from across the clearing, the way he sat with the stillness of someone receiving information they are deciding what to do with, of someone learning the dimensions of a person they had been in proximity to for a lifetime without actually looking at. After the food, the people had moved to the comfortable dispersal of a gathering that has passed its formal center into its social remainder. Olivia found herself standing near Ronald at the edge of the porch, looking out at the clearing in the low gold of late afternoon. He never talked about any of this, Ronald said. Not in the aggrieved way he'd said things in May, but in a different way. You say something when you are simply noting its truth, rather than defending yourself against it. Any of it. The land, the house, all those Saturdays. I'd call him sometimes and he'd say he was working, and I'd ask where. I'd say a job up north of town, and that was it. He said the same thing to me. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Ronald turned the cup in his hands. I never asked follow-up questions. I called when I needed something, and I talked about what I needed, and he listened, and when I was done, he'd say, "Okay, let me see what I can do," and then he'd do it. And I never once asked how he was doing with the same attention he gave to how I was doing. She didn't comfort him on this, because it was true and he knew it was true, and the knowing of it was where the work was, the real work, the kind that couldn't be done with a circular saw or a level. He was good at showing up, Ronald said. He was the best person I've ever known at just being there when you needed something. And I took that completely for granted. You're here now, Olivia said, not as absolution, Just as fact, Ronald looked at the 3 steps he had built on his first return visit, and then at the cedar railing above them that he had built on his second. 3 steps and a railing, he said. 5 to 7 years. You can't build 7 years in 3 steps. You can only build 3 steps. She looked at him steadily. He understood that. He built everything 1 piece at a time, after everyone had gone, after the last truck had pulled off the dirt track, and the clearing had returned to its specific evening, quiet with the particular completeness that comes when a group of people leaves a space, and the space remembers what it was before they arrived. Olivia walked through the house alone. This was the walk of completion, different from all the other walks she'd taken through these rooms in the past 14 weeks. She moved through each space without cataloging, without problem-solving, without the active forward lean of someone who has more to do. Just looking, just being in the thing that had been made. Kitchen, bathroom, first bedroom, second bedroom, still empty, waiting for whatever came next. Couch with its cedar railing and its 3 steps, and the 2 Adirondack chairs facing south in the warm evening. She sat down in the left chair. Flint jumped into the right one, circled 3 times, and lay down with his chin on the armrest. She'd want a dog someday. The clearing was in the last light of the day. The specific amber that comes at the end of a summer evening, when everything that the sun touches is the best version of itself. She sat in the chair her father had planned for. Big enough for 2 chairs, the notebook said, "She'll want company," and something beside her. And she looked at the house she had finished, and the clearing he had made, and the tree line where the pines stood in the last of the light, and she thought about the tin box and the 2 letters in it, and she thought about Bristol, Virginia, and what she was going to do about room 214. The letter from Bristol came on a Tuesday in early September. She found it in the mailbox at the top of the dirt track on her way home from Gary's mailbox. She had installed herself on a cedar post the Saturday after the house was finished, because a finished house with no address marker felt incomplete in the way that a sentence feels incomplete when it is missing its last word. Handwriting on the envelope was slow and deliberate, the handwriting of someone whose hands require more concentration than they once did, and who is taking the full measure of time that the work requires. Her name, address on Miller Creek Road, the return address in the upper left corner, S. Scott, room 214, Greenfield Care Center, Bristol, VA. She sat down on the top step of the porch. Flint came around from wherever he'd been spending the afternoon and sat beside her with the solid, warm presence of a dog who has learned that when a person sits down outside unexpectedly, it is generally worth staying nearby. She opened the envelope, the unpage. The handwriting was the same deliberate, careful script as the address. Each letter formed with individual attention, lines slightly uneven in a way that spoke of concentration and effort, and the refusal to stop doing a thing just because it had become more difficult than it used to be. Olivia, I read your letter 4 times. The staff here had to bring me tissues twice, which I hope they'll forgive me for. I'm still here. Room 214. Still here, and still in it, which on the hard days is the only thing I can say, and on the better days feels like something. My hands don't cooperate the way they used to, but they can write if I go slowly, so I go slowly, which is how I have learned to do most things. Your father was the best man I ever knew. I want you to know I understood that while I knew him, and I have understood it every single day since. My decision was not a decision about him. It was a decision I made inside a diagnosis I was terrified of, about the kind of loss I was willing to let you carry. And I have lived inside the question of whether I made the right call for 15 years without arriving anywhere clean. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the decisions that matter most are the ones you have to keep living inside, rather than the ones you can resolve and move past. You sound like him. Specifically and in detail, you sound like him in the way you described the house. Not I finished, but I finished what he started. That's a distinction a person makes when they understand that a thing belongs to more than one moment and more than one pair of hands. I've said it exactly that way. I would very much like it if you wrote again. I am not asking you to come. I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I want to keep getting letters from you if you are willing to write them. Whenever you are ready. However long that takes, I love you. I have loved you every single day since the day you were born, including the 15 years I spent on the wrong side of a decision I cannot undo. Mom Olivia read the letter once. Then she sat with it in her lap for a while and looked out at the clearing in the early September light, which was different from the August light in ways that were subtle but definite. Less heavy, more angled, beginning its seasonal shift toward the quality that comes when the year starts to understand it is turning. Is not going to Bristol today. She knew that clearly and without conflict, the way you know things that are true rather than things you wish were true. The letters could go back and forth for a while. Letters were a door of their own kind. One you could open and close at the pace the situation actually required, rather than the pace you thought you should be able to manage. She thought about the tin box on the kitchen shelf, hoped about a 27-year-old woman in a doctor's office in Charlotte, receiving information that would take the next several decades from her and making a decision about who to be inside that fact. She thought about her father reading that first letter and putting it in a tin box and building a house instead of writing back, which was its own kind of response, the response of a man whose language was always the work rather than the word. Spent 15 years filling the blank of her mother's absence with the worst possible explanation, and the explanation had not been the worst possible one. It had been complicated and flawed, and motivated by something that was, at its center, love expressed so badly that it looked like abandonment from the outside, and had functioned as abandonment in practice. But love nonetheless, love that had been trying to protect something, and had instead cost something. Attempts at protection sometimes do. She was not finished forgiving. She knew that. The forgiving would come or not come in its own time, and she was not going to accelerate it for the sake of a resolution that felt complete from the outside. But the door was open. The letter had been sent, and the letter had come back. And that was a beginning, the kind of beginning that doesn't announce itself but simply exists as the first step of something that will be longer than one step. She put the letter back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands for a moment. And then she went inside and put it in the tin box with the 2 letters from Sandra that James had kept. The tin box now holding 3 letters instead of 2, a correspondence of a family that had been scattered and was, slowly and with difficulty, and without any guarantee of outcome, beginning to find its way towards something that might eventually resemble its own version of together. Like the morning of the last day of summer began the way the mornings had begun since she'd arrived, with the light. It came through the east window the way it always came, the first direct light of the day, particular quality of it that had been what her father meant when he'd written on page 4. East window for Olivia's room. She always said she wanted to wake up with the sun. He had built the window for this light. They had woken to this light for 14 weeks now, every morning, and she had not stopped noticing it. She lay still for a moment and let it do what it did. Then she got up, made coffee on the 2-burner gas range Margaret had found at an estate sale in June, connected the previous month when she'd finally gotten around to the gas line connection, and she poured it into the enamel camp mug. Her father's mug, on the first night, still in use because there was no reason not to use a thing that worked, and she went out to the porch, the 2 Adirondack chairs, side by side. Facing south, she sat in the left one. Flint jumped into the right, circled 3 times, lay down. The clearing was in the first light of the day. Dew on the grass. The cedar lumber stack under its tarp, diminished from 14 weeks of use, most of what it had held incorporated into the house. Eyebrow her father had left upside down near the tree line, still upside down, still in its exact position from the day she'd found it. She had not moved it. It was his, and some things that belong to the past are allowed to stay where they are. She had $47 on the day she'd stepped off the bus in Ridgerton. That money was long gone, faced by the small accumulation of Gary's paychecks across a summer, enough for food and materials and nothing much else. But she had a deed and a will and a house. She had finished one task at a time. I had a job that paid $12 an hour and would continue to pay it. And she had a neighbor 2 miles east who made pot roast and supervised railings with exacting standards and had become, without anyone formally arranging it, the closest thing to a grandmother she had ever had. She had a community of people who had known her father and had chosen her in consequence, which was not how she would have described community before this summer, but was now the only description that felt accurate. She had a dog in the right chair who had been her father's dog, and had become her dog as naturally as a river changes course when the landscape shifts, best to say without announcement and without drama, and in the direction that the terrain required. She had a letter in a tin box from a woman in Bristol, Virginia, who signed herself Mom, loved her every day from the wrong side of a decision that could not be undone, who was waiting, slowly and without pressure, for whatever came next. She had the notebook. They took it from her jacket pocket. She had started carrying it with her, the way her father had carried it, the way you carry a thing that you are still writing. And she opened it to page 30, latest blank page after everything she had written across the summer. She picked up the pencil she kept in the notebook's spiral binding, and she wrote the date. She sat for a while before she wrote anything else. Light moved across the clearing the way light moves in the early morning, purposeful and patient, covering ground without appearing to hurry. Flint breathed beside her. The coffee cooled in the mug and she drank it anyway, because cold coffee at the end of a cup is still coffee. She was not finished. She understood that clearly and without distress. The house was finished, but she was not finished. She was 19 years old, and the house was the ground she was standing on, not the destination, and her father had known that, had built it into the design of the thing. A second bedroom for when she needs more than herself, porch big enough for more than one chair, plan for more than she can see from where she is now. She wrote, September, first morning of fall light, house is done. The seats in the tin add to $14,212 and 7 years of Saturdays. Dad built the thing I needed to stand on. The rest is mine to build. She looked at what she had written. Then she added one more line. Oh me, every day, he saw me. And now I see what that means. She set the pencil down on the arm of the chair, drank the last of the coffee, watched the clearing come fully into the light. Flint's breathing slowed into sleep beside her. Safe. The pines at the edge of the clearing stood in the morning the way they had stood through 7 years of her father's Saturdays, and 14 weeks of her own work, and all the weather and all the seasons between, unchanged and patient and entirely themselves, and the house behind her, pale blue, small, complete, held its position on the slight rise of ground the way things hold when they have been built to last. Iced window caught the morning sun and threw it back as light. She had come here with $47 and a deed, and no idea what she was walking into. She was still here. That was everything.